Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Lifestyle Gardening. I'm Kim Todd and I hope you've got yourself shoveled out of our most recent snowstorm. On this week's show we're going to help new homeowners with design principles for their outdoor space. We'll be checking out the new garden trends for 2019 and we'll talk with orchard manager Vaughn Hammond to hear about growing peaches. In the meantime, let's get our program rolling with a look at grading and drainage around your yard. There are probably going to be a few areas where that water seems to settle and other areas can't seem to get watered enough. Let's examine how these issues might affect your planting beds, trees and shrubs, turf, and what you can do about it. As any of you who either have a wet basement or have no way to get from your front yard to your backyard know, the grading and drainage around a property is really important. You can start fresh with brand new construction and your grade seems to work out just perfectly. Over time, of course, in an older neighborhood particularly, you're going to end up with some settling, some low spots, some places where that grade is just not working out right. So, one of the most important things for you to consider as you are either renovating a landscape, purchasing a home, looking at making some changes is, does that water run downhill in the direction you want it, at the speed you want it, at the slope you want it, and end up in the places where you want it to land. This is important not only for stormwater runoff, of course, but for just general, gentle Mother Nature rain. If you're fortunate, you may have a survey that shows topographic lines on it. This is most likely to occur if it's new construction, if it's sometimes has to be fairly high-end residential, or it is something you're going to have to pay for if you want that surveyor to give you exactly property lines, measurements, and that change in grade. Those grade lines are shown as a 1-foot contour, and they tell you, once you learn how to read them, which direction that water flows. They also show you the slope. The closer together those lines are, the steeper the slope is. That will mean either a hill or in some cases a retaining wall. The further apart those lines are, the flatter the property is, and sometimes flatter might be harder to work with than steep because a flat site is going to end up with what we call bird bathing. You're going to have some standing water. If you're not fortunate enough to have a survey, you're going to have to either get one if you really need to be concise in your grading plan, or certainly learn how to look at that landscape and then figure out how you want to change that grade so that it does work. One of the things that we encounter in landscape and in grading is people want a berm. And they think about that berm as being an object as opposed to something that actually flows into the surrounding contours. Doesn't make sense to just essentially pile soil in the front yard and then there it sits. It looks like an object rather than a gently rolling hill in the landscape. And again, if you haven't considered the fact that water has to run downhill away from the places or the structures where you don't want it to pond or settle, you may in fact, by building a berm, have trapped water between the building and the berm itself. So one of the things that I tell people to do is take a scale, take a plumb line, take a level, take a string, and simply slant. Look at, okay, follow the grade. Is the grade doing this toward your home or is it doing this? For building a berm or a landform, remember that what goes up has to come back down again. And if you don't have the horizontal distance in which you can go as high as you want, you're either going to have to build that berm lower or you're going to have to consider eliminating a berm altogether. It's a complicated, but it's a very interesting part of landscape design and management and of course construction. And one of those areas where the more you either learn about it or the more observant you are, the better job you're going to be able to do to get your landscape graded properly to begin with, so your patios work, your driveways work, your plant material that needs a drink is in the low spots, the plants that don't need a drink are in the high spots. You probably don't have to live with a few of these areas around your home, and understanding where those wet and dry spots are is part of being a really good gardener. Choosing drought or flood tolerant plants will also help you in those problem areas. It's time now to talk to our new gardeners about making plans for their outdoor space around their home. We've covered understanding what you have and coming up with concepts. Practical landscapes don't just happen. You have to make a few decisions about what purpose you want for your front and your backyards. So for this week's Go Gardening feature, we talk about making your plan a reality. We've walked you through the process of how you actually take inventory or assess what you've got on your property. We've also talked to you about how you figure out what you want and need, and those are really important pieces before you decide to pick that first plant, put that plant in the ground, or pour or put that pavement on the ground or in the ground. So at this point, we want to talk about design development. You've put those two pieces together. You perhaps, even though you don't have good graphic skills and you don't need them, you have created a couple of concepts. You've decided you like a path in one place, you want the shed over here. A second concept might be you want the path to go the other direction, you want the shed over there. Or fire pit, no fire pit. So you've played around with those concepts. Now it's time to say, gosh, I really like elements of both or all of those concepts. How do I put them together? That is what we call design development. So you get to take the best pieces of your own thought process, in this case, and it's almost like playing paper dolls or building something out of Legos without the Legos. You take those pieces and you think a little bit more deeply about, okay, what do I really want to put together that works for me? Taking into consideration all of those elements. In that design development drawing then, you begin to really pin down or hone into the most important elements, the best placement for your purposes. If it is living material that you have in mind, which we of course hope you do from backyard and lifestyle gardening, you take a look at or you think about pretty hard, will the site itself support those particular plants? That design development drawing then becomes the basis for what will be your final plans. Again, knowing that final doesn't really mean final forever because you get to change everything in your landscape when you decide it is time for a change. In the design development drawings, or in that next piece that has put together the concepts, in terms of putting plant material, putting use areas in the correct places, again, you take a look at what is the relationship between all of those elements that are important to you. How does the path work? Can you access the garden? Are you close enough to the hydrant or to a water source if you're using a hose to do the watering of the garden or the raised beds or new trees? Have you left enough space so that you can pile the snow without doing damage to some of the materials in your landscape or blocking a path? So design development, again, takes everything that you have already analyzed and assessed, your conceptual thinking, everything you want and need, brings it down to more detail, more practicality, the actual development plan that you will then use for the very next steps, which are, for a lot of people, the most fun part, and that is choosing the plants, choosing the hardscape materials, the furnishings, the lighting, all of those details that are so wonderful and really make your landscape your very own. All of those factors come into play when you're fulfilling your outdoor space wants and needs, and your lifestyle needs, like having a place for kids and pets to play, growing your own food, or having spaces for entertaining friends and family, really will help you make a great plan and a great installation. Moving on to our landscape lesson for the week, it's a bit of a tradition for us to tell you some of the trends in horticulture every year. For 2019, there are going to be some cornerstones in gardening, like growing your own food and keeping the grass green. But let's take a few minutes to hear about what's new in the gardening world for this season. One of the things we really like to talk about early on in the season is what are the gardening trends for the coming year. Depending on your source for that information, they're going to be a little bit different. But of course, as we look at trends, we like to pull out the ones that really trend over various sources. This can be anything from small detailed trends to the color of the year, which is living coral this year, and people will be wanting plants that match that color in their landscape. But the ones that are really more timeless, that are going to encourage people to use their landscapes differently and think about it differently, are the ones that are most important. So we start certainly this year with low input landscape, or a return to Mother Nature, which of course is something we talk about all the time on lifestyle gardening. Another one that is very, very important is food. Your own backyard, an edible landscape, growing more and more food that you can either use yourself or you can donate, which is also another trend. And that trend is volunteerism, or giving back. Giving back not only of your garden produce itself, but certainly giving back of your own self, your own volunteer hours. Very great trend, one that we really love to talk about because of course we use our volunteers all the time for Backyard Farmer. Engaging children in the landscape is another trend, of course, that really is very timeless. If we can get young people to understand nature and love nature, and then go into nature and understand nature, when they become older people, they will actually do things right. That would also include choosing materials that can be reused, repurposed, recycled, compost. That's a trend that certainly we hope will never go away because it is so important. But that also ties to a trend of choosing materials that are tough, strong, sturdy, will not fall apart in the garden. Because first off, that will contribute to a greater overall design concept, and you will be treating Mother Nature as well as she deserves to be treated. Of course, you can still grow your tomatoes and keep that turf lush and green. But part of the fun of gardening is trying out new plants, new colors, and new techniques. And we always want you to have as much fun as possible when you're out doing that gardening. For our first two interviews with industry professionals, we took a look at how plants in public places are selected and overwintered. We're going to change up the subject this week as we talk to our friend Vaughn Hammond of Kimmel Orchard. Vaughn's going to give us some expert advice on caring for peach trees. Nebraska's extreme temperatures and random precipitation can make growing those peaches pretty tricky. But Vaughn's here to tell us a few tips to making your home peach orchard a success. Vaughn Hammond from Kimmel Orchard and Vineyard is sharing all of his expertise with us today about favorite fruit, peaches. So many people in Nebraska, Vaughn, want to grow peaches. Vaughn, since they love them, there are still some things they need to know before they can grow them. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is that they need to know?
Well, first off, peaches, unlike apples, you know, you can pretty much consistently figure you're going to get an apple crop. You know, of course, some years it doesn't happen. With peaches, my goal is to hopefully get peaches 3 out of 5 years. Peaches are a very early blooming type of fruit. Peaches, apricots, and so what you have is a situation that you have bloom during a period of time that we still may get a killing frost, and those flowers will disappear with those cold temperatures. So not every year can you be sure that the weather is going to cooperate with your peach crop. Another one of the problems with peaches is they have different insect pests, of course, as compared to an apple tree. First off, there's several insects that affect the peach tree, primarily plum cucurleo, which affects the fruit, comes in and eats on the fruit and causes a phenomenon called cap facing on the fruit. The fruit's still very edible, but it looks a little strange. Then you have the greater and lesser peach tree borers, which bore into the trunk and the scaffolding branches, creating weak trunks and weak scaffolds, which then adds to the short-lived nature of a peach tree. And then, of course, you have to worry about just, you know, not only are peaches delicious to us, it's everything out there as far as raccoons and birds and Japanese beetles. All these things absolutely love peaches, so it's protecting your crop from those critters also.
Peaches look awfully different than apple trees in the background. Are there specific things about the pruning or the pests or the management of peach trees that really make it a completely different crop, especially for the homeowner?
Pruning is completely different with the peach tree as compared to the apple tree. Peaches grow on, or fruit on 1-year-old wood, okay? And so that wood is very, very evident in that it is brightly colored. So when you're pruning a peach tree, you're looking to have 3 scaffold branches, possibly 4, and you're looking at having an open vase type of system where the sunlight can penetrate the tree from all directions, because it takes that good sunlight to change the carbohydrates into the sugars that we think are delicious for the peach fruit itself. So a nice open system. And then the other thing that you want to look at is the length of the new growth. The length of the new growth needs to be about no more than 18 inches, because if you get 24 inches and you get that fruit hanging, all of a sudden that twig is breaking because it is a very small branch. Whereas if you keep it shorter, at about 18 inches, it's a little bit stronger and will hold the fruit a lot better. The other thing is reducing the height of the tree. You don't want your peach tree to be probably any taller than 8 to maybe 9 foot, because a perfect peach is, again, a ripe peach. When you go to the store, they harvest the peaches green because of shipping, and they're harder. As a homeowner, you're harvesting ripe peaches. You don't want to have to get up on a ladder to get that soft, ripe peach. So you want to be able to harvest it from the ground. So you want to have that tree open and easy access for sunlight and for you as the person taking care of the tree.
Okay.
The other thing about peaches is pruning. Apples you prune when the tree's dormant from very late November until, hopefully you're done by January, February. With peaches, it's totally kind of different. You want them to be dormant, but you want it to be at the end of dormancy, because pruning will actually stave off bud break a little bit. So if you can wait until right before bud break, you can stave off that bud break a tad, which may give you a few days longer for those cold temperatures to get a little bit warmer. So pruning just before bud break.
And of course, that $1 million or 15-year question is, if people are only going to get peaches about every 3 to 5 years, how long do those peach trees live?
Well, for us being in a commercial situation, it's a lot different than the homeowners. We look for 8 to 12 years out of our peach trees. And a homeowner, on the other hand, can look at maybe possibly a little bit longer. Of course, each situation is different, but you can hopefully get maybe 15 years and maybe stretch it even a little further. But a peach tree is much shorter lived than an apple tree for sure.
All right, thanks, Fawn.
You bet.
Setting realistic goals for your peach trees means managing pest problems, keeping those pruning shears handy, and being patient with our weather. But there's really nothing more rewarding than a homegrown peach right off the tree. It's time now to answer a few of your questions. If you've got a question you'd like to submit to the show, just drop us an email at byf@unl.edu. And as always, please tell us as much information as you can, including where you live. Attach those pictures as JPEGs. Our first question comes to us from Grand Island, and this is a viewer who moved into a 30-year-old home in December. They love it, but the lawn is very brown compared to the neighbor's lawn and even their previous lawn. And of course, that doesn't go over very well in neighborhoods. They're guessing the previous owners did not fertilize, certainly not in 2018, and maybe even not before that at all. So they have a couple of questions. First off, could they apply fertilizer and weed killer now, perhaps when the moisture is predicted, which heaven only knows, we might still be getting some of that white stuff? Answer to that is no, don't do that. That is a waste of chemical. It will not do you any good. Fertilizing in the middle of the winter, no, we don't recommend that. It could get runoff, it could get swallowed up, it could end up being something that you just don't want on your pavement. And certainly weed killer, the only way weed killers work are either as a pre or a post emergent. And pre-emerge, it's actually going to deteriorate in the soil until it gets warm enough. And of course, post-emergent means those weeds have to be up. So no on those two questions. They do have an underground sprinkler system, so at least the lawn was being watered. As we look at the turf, even though we didn't have a close-up picture for the show, it looks like it is a pretty old turf. It's pretty clumpy, probably did not get any fertilization. It probably has not been aerated. A lot of issues associated maybe even with just old turf species if these owners did not take care of it. So it may be time in the spring to go ahead and go in and really do a major renovation for this turf so you can get rid of that clumpy old appearance to start with and have something a little bit more uniform. And of course, on Backyard Farmer, one of our primary questions we get a lot, especially in the spring, is what can I do about my turf? So we'll have more information for this viewer from Grand Island as we start our show in April this year. We have a question from Seward. This is one that could probably come from a lot of different locations in the state. Rabbits have been eating the bottom of their trees. They've tried using oil, they've tried hot pepper sprays, among other sorts of things. The question is, should they keep these trees? Will they be okay? And they're for privacy. So here are a couple of thoughts on that. They look like they are one of the arborvitaes, probably the selection called Green Giant. They have some damage on the trunk. It's a little hard to tell from the images how much damage there is. Does not look like a good mulch ring around the base to begin with, so you want to mulch widely, and that's in spite of or with the rabbits or any other creature that wants to eat your trees. But Dennis would tell you that yes, you can go ahead and try those sprays and those oils and all those kinds of things. They work maybe, but they have to be reapplied when it gets wet. It's essentially, with some beasties, it is hazing. They don't like the taste. They're not going to come back to that plant. With rabbits, really the best way to protect them from damage is exclusion. As we wrap up today's program, we're going to hear from one of our Backyard Farmer panelists about sampling. Nebraska Extension plant diagnostician Kyle Broderick takes us into his lab to talk to us about what makes a good sample and how he determines what your rotter spot actually is. He can do a lot with a microscope, but as Kyle tells us, a good diagnosis is only as good as your paperwork and the sample you send him.
When plant samples first come in to the University of Nebraska's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic, there are a variety of tests that we will do in order to figure out what exactly is going wrong with them. And we always ask that people submit a sample identification form along with their plant sample. That provides us with most of the information that would be needed in order to successfully diagnose the sample. We have portions for where you're located, which gives us a good idea about the localized environment, as well as individual issues for what you're actually seeing on the plant sample. Remember, 2 to 3 days later when the sample gets to us via mail, those symptoms may have changed. When things sit in a plastic bag over the weekend, we get a lot of extra fungi that start to sporulate, and what I see when I look at the sample might be a little bit different than what you see when you originally wanted to send that sample in. The main types of plant pathogens that we see around here are fungal pathogens, bacterial pathogens, and viral pathogens. We also have some nematode issues, but fungi, bacteria, and viruses are the main thing that we get here in the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. So when a fungal sample comes in, one of the first things that we'll do is we'll try to look at the sample and see, is it actually sporulating? And are we able to determine what the disease is based on the spore type that we see? If it's a bacterial disease, one of the things that we often have to do is cut the plant open, try to isolate that bacteria, and then do a series of tests to figure out what that exact bacterial pathogen is. If we have a fungal sample that comes into the clinic and it's not sporulating, one of the things that we'll often do is create a humidity chamber. Once we have a sample in the humidity chamber and we're able to see that fungus growing out of the sample, or if it's on an individual plate, and we've been able to successfully isolate the pathogen that way, we'll then look at it underneath some of our high-powered microscopes. And that allows us to see those individual spore types to determine what exactly we are looking at. And the shape of the spores often determines what we're seeing. And so once we have an actively sporulating fungal pathogen on the leaves, one of the easiest methods we can use to diagnose it is what's called a wet mount. And all that we use for the wet mount is a glass cover slip, some clear Scotch tape, and sterile water. And what we do is we'll put one drop of water onto the cover slip, and then a piece of the Scotch tape onto the sporulating portion of the plant leaf, and then transfer that tape onto our glass slide. And from there, we'll look at it underneath our high-powered microscope. And again, it is the shape of these individual spores underneath the microscope that gives us an idea of what that fungal pathogen is. In this case, we're looking at powdery mildew on these succulents here. And as you can see behind me, that we have plenty of spores that have been picked up through the Scotch tape and are readily identifiable on the microscope. If we don't have an active fungal culture on the plant leaf, we may need to isolate that tissue and put it on a Petri plate. And from there, we can look at a portion of that Petri plate underneath the microscope as well, and there we'll find our different hyphal structures or potentially spores that have formed on that Petri plate to help us identify what that pathogen is as well.
A good sample and good information about what is happening can make all the difference in diagnosing and then fixing your disease or your insect pest problems. You can also check out the Backyard Farmer YouTube video channel to hear Kyle talking about how to mail in a good sample. Thank you so much for joining us again for Lifestyle Gardening. Next time we'll be hearing more from Vaughn Hammond, but this time he'll be focusing on apple trees. We'll also feature hardscape ideas and new plants at the Garden Center. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So good morning, good gardening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time on Lifestyle Gardening.